Good evening and welcome. Tonight's event is the third and final event in our Latino Latin American Studies Fall Series this semester on the theme of Politics of the Imagination, Constructing Futures. The series theme is grounded in two fundamental ideas. First, that the work of the imagination, i.e. the envisioning and inventiveness that responds to reality and presents alternatives to what is an essential component of art, but also of all political activity, which is to say, of all activity focused on shaping the circumstances of human life and community. Second, that how we imagine the future guides how we engage with the present, whether the future we imagine is utopian, dystopian, or reproduces the status quo. Latinx performance artist Guillermo Gomez Peña has said, quote, "My discourse is first of all an artistic discourse because my main tool is the imagination. You know, I worship the imagination. I think that losing imagination can be even more dangerous than losing our civil rights." In our previous two events, our fall series has explored imagined futures brought into public conversation through literature, theology, and film. Tonight's event will focus on theater. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Leticia Robles-Moreno. She received her doctorate from New York University's Department of Performance Studies and is currently assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at Muhlenberg College. Dr. Robles-Moreno is a scholar practitioner whose work explores how theater, art, and activism performed by women builds networked practices as strategies of resistance and survival. She has published scholarly articles in Latin American Theater Review, Contemporary Theater Review, Hispanic Issues Online, and Conjunto. From 2010 to 2017, she served as project manager of the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics Digital Video Library. Tonight, she will present All the Streets Are a Stage, Performing Transnational Artivisms in the Americas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robles-Moreno.
Hello? I think I'm okay. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I would like to start by thanking the Latino and Latin American Studies program for inviting me to share my work with you all. Thank you, Pros Campo, for opening spaces for dialogue, much needed dialogue. Thank you, Roy and Danielle, as well, for your work with RAD and for being so game for the workshop last night. Thank you also, I know she's not here, but to Mary Nidenfuer, because she did a lot of work to make this happen. And a special thanks to Megan Sheehan for thinking of me and my work. And also, we're all usually very absorbed in our own research and our thoughts. And Megan is a person she doesn't only do a wonderful research, but she's always listening, okay, and finding connections and possibilities for collaboration. And that is a much, much needed quality these days. Thank you very much for inviting me and for your hospitality. So also, thank you to the wonderful RAD students and the non-RAD yet students who participated in the workshop yesterday. It was really, really inspiring. Thank you very much. And also, I want to acknowledge our political moment. Right now, we're all waiting for the results of the election, so I know that we're going to be thinking about that a lot, okay? So we are immersed in a critical moment, okay? A crisis, okay, that the Brazilian director Augusto Boal would call a Chinese crisis, okay? And Augusto Boal liked to randomly assign gentilicios, adjectives of nationalities, to his games. I'm going to go back to this later, okay? But yes, it's a crisis. But the way that Augusto Boal thought about crisis is at that moment, okay, where the events can go worse or better depending on our decisions and the actions that come from those decisions. So a critical moment can bring change, okay? Always, for good or for bad. We don't know what is happening. We don't know what is going to happen, but we know that it's a big-scale crisis, and it's up to us. We have to believe that it's up to us to set the direction where we all go from here. What do we think when we imagine what theater and performance do? Usually, a building with a stage, seats for the audience, and a set of predetermined roles to be played both by actors and the crew that works behind the curtains. And yes, curtains are part of this image of theater. However, this is a very particular way of doing theater that draws from Western traditions, from ancient Greek tragedy to the 19th century. This 19th century European theater was made for bourgeois consumption and was a specific way of doing theater. By using the term theater to refer to these particular cultural expressions, we are at risk of forgetting and therefore erasing the multiple non-Western theatricalities that go beyond the theater building, the authorship of a script, or even the division of labor among participants of the theatrical event. I mentioned that we're going through a critical historic moment when our doing might set the course of events of what is yet to come. Here is where I want to bring some lessons from Latin America through the work of several artists and groups that take the streets as the space to perform their claims, their protests, and their hopes. In dialogue with social movements, these artists take the theatrical stage to the streets and vice versa, progressively blurring the boundaries between art and activism in order to hold politicians accountable and to demand respect for civil rights. I want to start with the concept of creación colectiva in Latin America, collective creation. There is a concept and a practice that is not about the aesthetic spectacularity of a production, but about being with each other in a shared experience. So I want to, if you don't know them, I want to present you to this group. It's Grupo Cultural Yuyashkani from Peru. They work on stage. Okay, and Teatro La Candelaria from Colombia. Teatro La Candelaria was founded in 1966, and Grupo Cultural Yuyashkani in 1971 in Peru. Okay, and they keep working on stage. They keep doing their work together. They managed to stay together all this time. Each of these groups has developed its own ethics and aesthetic lines of creación colectiva, a creative process that involves three central characteristics. One, a commitment to group life. They live as a collective. Number two, an activist commitment to social politics. They always writing and performing in dialogue with their contexts. And three, a performer's dramaturgy, whereby all the work originates in and through the actor's body. They don't follow the script. They create the script. The artistic director, in each case, shapes the processes into a coherent aesthetic form, conducting groups that have worked together for decades. Creación colectiva groups have always reinvented their performances in direct relation to the political crisis in their countries. Originally inspired by the Marxist ideology of the 60s that stressed collective responses to social problems, these groups have modeled a particular notion and practice of the collective, which both allows and demands flexibility and openness. Their work also allows and demands the co-presence of bodies on stage and in the audience, what Jorge Dubati calls el convivio teatral, the theatrical conviviality or coexistence, a shared experience. And here I'm making a difference between the spectacle of theater, and that element of theater is about conviviality and coexistence. Historically, Teatro de Creación Colectiva and the arts in a general sense have inhabited precarity because our Latin American countries have lived in a constant state of crisis. Centuries of colonizations, independence wars, caudillismo, dictatorships, and neo-imperialism, among other struggles, have imprinted in Latin America both the instability of crisis and the drive for survival. La Candelaria and Yuyashkani are not only examples of survival, but also, I believe, a model of becoming a collective for current acts of resistance, not only in Latin America, but everywhere. Since its foundation in 1966, Teatro La Candelaria was conceived as a site of dialogue among artists, unions, workers, displaced citizens, and student movements. Santiago Garcia, who is in the picture, and Patricia Ariza, who is a maestra, began the group amidst la violencia in Colombia, having in mind the goal of producing a theater that Latin America could call its own. They brought urgent social and political themes to the stage and played a protagonist role in cultural policies and social justice struggles in Bogota and the rest of the country. Patricia Ariza, actress and director of the group, says that a series of performative gestures, music, dance, color, repetition of words, movement around the space, are more efficient than less imaginative protests where people might chant their mottos and hold signs. And if you ask me, fascism is not creative at all. Okay? The idea of fascism is to suppress creativity and becoming uniform, opaque, and predictive, where resistance is open, creative, and unpredictable. So we have to also acknowledge our strengths. Mujeres en la Plaza, show you this. This is one of the examples of creative resistance and bringing the theater to the streets to make a statement. Mujeres en la Plaza was performed with the mothers, sisters, daughters, and relatives of the disappeared by la violencia in the Plaza de Bolívar in downtown Bogota, within the frame of the 7th Encuentro of the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics. More than 300 women and relatives of Colombian citizens who had been disappeared during the years of violence, together with singers, dancers, and actresses, reclaimed their right to a long postponed mourning. The question that the women gathered in the plaza asked, "Where are they? ¿Dónde están?" reverberated in every corner of the public square. This performance, Mujeres en la Plaza, was in dialogue with Teatro La Candelaria's version of Antigone, where several actresses gave voice and presence to Antigone and her sister Ismene. And if you remember, Antigone confronts Creon, an authoritarian king, because she wants to bury her brother, and Creon was forbidding Antigone to do this. Okay? So the idea of not being able to mourn is in that Greek classic. La Candelaria takes this and brings to the current struggle of people, real people, everyday people, who are still waiting for the disappear to know something about them, okay? So mirroring this theatrical strategy, hundreds of Colombian women performed in the heart of the city of Bogota, demanding justice as if they were one. La Candelaria was inviting passers-by to see the ruins of a war that was denying sisters, mother's daughter, the right to mourn. In this case, el convivio, the shared experience, the conviviality, didn't stay in the theater building. On the contrary, the circulation of bodies on and off stage generated networks and structures that make collective work possible. And here it's worth noting the key role of the material conditions that play in the circulation of this performance. In the case of Mujeres en la Plaza, the Hemispheric Institute 7 Encuentro established the conditions of possibility for the conviviality within a transnational context. So we also have to acknowledge what kind of connections we can set in order to allow for this kind of performances and collaborations to happen. I want to show you a couple of pictures. None of these women are quote-unquote performers. And they were just magnificent. And I want just to show you a couple of seconds. Did you get the idea?
Kinamararai, 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 perroso ki taucheke hai ha, chosisia, choetroa, perroso ki kinamararai.
Yo, Antígona, sobreviví al llanto, pero no pude sobrevivir al duelo de mi hermano.
Si algo quieres llorar, cántalo también. Y cuando nacen las penas se van revolviendo en el corazón. Y sin querer ya se van volviendo canción. Que cuando todo esté oscuro, velo pintando. Con el color que te va dictando la voz.
I just want to point out the moment where all of the women in the plaza, las mujeres en la plaza, just hug each other in a moment of solidarity. So remembering people walking with signs demanding the question, ¿dónde están? It's already a powerful gesture, but what about the colors? What about only women, the dance, the music? Okay, all of that gets imprinted in the imagination and the remembrance of the passersby who didn't pay for a ticket to see a play. I'm going to go back to. So in current times of crisis, it is vital to think about the potentialities of this kind of work. Discussing with a Brazilian colleague the recent election of overtly fascist politician Jair Bolsonaro, he remembered what Deleuze and Guattari warned in 1000 Plateaus. And I quote, "What makes fascism dangerous is its molecular power or micropolitics, because it is a mass movement, a cancerous body and not a totalitarian organism. Only the microfascism can give us an answer to this global question. Why desire desires its own repression? How can it desire its own repression?" End of quote. Why electing fascism? Why getting into that? What to get basically carried away by fascism? Yes, fascism is incoherent and contagious. But I want to add here that resistance is also contagious, and it can also operate in a molecular level of transformation. Mujeres en la Plaza is a very interesting example of this. It was a labor of contagion. The complicated choreographies that they staged in the Plaza de Bolívar couldn't be rehearsed there without the police noticing it. You can have 300 women rehearsing the intervención, right? So for this reason, Patricia Ariza, and other actresses from La Candelaria worked with a group of women who were the leaders in different neighborhoods in Bogotá's outskirts. These women taught the choreographies to their compañeras back home. The day of the intervención, every woman knew her role and her movements and how to interact with hundreds of other bodies in the plaza. This was an action shared, organized, and performed by hundreds of women becoming one. Moreover, this contagion were intended to happen by performing in a public space. Ariza wanted to touch the audience and publicly acknowledge the pain of the women who were still looking for their loved ones. Her ultimate goal was to get this audience to quote the woman who performed in the plaza and to repeat the question that filled the plaza. Where are they? ¿Dónde están? So think about the contagiousness of resistance, okay, that can counteract the contagiousness of fascism as well. Following this idea of resistance and contagion, Mexican, Here you go. Mexican director, actress, playwright, performance artist, scenographer, entrepreneur, and social activist, Jesusa Rodriguez performs shows that challenge traditional classification, crossing generic boundaries, from elite to popular to mass, from Greek tragedy to cabaret, from pre-Columbian indigenous to opera. She does everything. She's fantastic. For 15 years, she ran the famous El Hábito Cabaret Bar in Mexico City with her wonderful wife, Liliana Felipe. There are two of them, wonderful, the day of their wedding. And you know, in Mexico, it's not quote unquote legal, so it was a huge performance also to get married with these beautiful dresses. So with Elena Felipe, they worked with El Hábito with 15 years. And most recently, Jesusa Rodriguez leads the Resistencia Creativa movement in Mexico, creative resistance, whose key strategy is using massive cabaret as a tool for political action. And I want to unpack this idea of massive cabaret. It is about bringing cabaret's sense of community and political imagination to an open space where thousands of people can become part of, again, a shared experience. Modern-style cabaret happens in an enclosed space where people who think and feel similarly gather to enjoy a moment of freedom and to expand their critical thinking. Plus, it's fun. Going to the cabaret is super fun. However, if you think about it, spaces as El Hábito Cabaret, as beautiful and inspiring as they are, exhaust their potentiality for a bigger change precisely because it doesn't reach a lot of people. Like theater that happens within four walls, it is usually made by and intended for like-minded people. Now, I have to point out that I have nothing against this possibility or about theater on stage. I love cabaret, I love theater on stage, I love my students in the theater department. I'm always amazed of their talent and the way that they perform from Shakespeare to Peter Schaffer. But I always remind my students that, one, their audience already knows what to expect, and in a sense, they are preaching to the choir, right? And two, what they do, it hardly goes beyond those four walls of the theater building. So the question is how to bring the potentialities for critical thinking and for change beyond those walls. And as a matter of fact, beyond these walls, where I'm basically preaching to the choir, right? And also how to bring what theater, performance, or cabaret offer, like collaboration, team building, critical thinking, and creative tactics to the public space. So we have Jesusa Rodriguez, and she has been thinking about this for years. Jesusa Rodriguez worked on this possibility with Resistencia Creativa, bringing her notion of massive cabaret to the main square, the Zócalo, in Mexico City. The Zócalo has been a gathering place for Mexicans since Aztec times, having been the site for Mexica ceremonies, the swearing of viceroys, royal proclamations, military parades, independence ceremonies, and modern religious events, such as the festivals of Holy Week and Corpus Christi. It's the main venue for both national celebration and national protests and marches and rallies that commonly go through Paseo de la Reforma, a main avenue, to El Zócalo. In 2006, the right-wing PAN, the National Action Party, led by Felipe Calderón in Mexico, won the Mexican presidential elections by the slimmest of margins. The leader of the left-wing PRD, Democratic Revolution Party, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or conocido como AMLO, accused the PAN of electoral fraud and demanded a recount vote by vote. There was a partial recount of polling stations, which in the end, it was claimed, confirmed Calderón's victory. In response to the official results, the PRD, AMLO's party, with the support of many other leftist organizations, established a massive plantón, a series of camps, in the Zócalo. They occupied the Zócalo. From July to September 2006, AMLO's supporters created a temporary community at the Zócalo. During 46 days, every afternoon, AMLO would give speeches and different politicians and public figures would discuss where to go from there. So think about this is 2006, Occupy Wall Street happened in 2011, so there is a continuity there. But of course, occupying the space is not enough to create a community. Here's where art came, bringing colorful ways of being in that community. The organizer, actually the director of this massive co-presence, was Jesusa Rodriguez. She was the woman behind the curtain. Yes, she's amazing. She's the best. She would MC the events, coordinate the presentation of artistic numbers, bring humor to the conversations, and work every day in Resistencia Creativa. Of course, the plantón caused frustration among citizens as they blocked access to the city's main avenues. They had a direct impact on downtown businesses and everyday activity. And yes, there is risk in taking public spaces and a big risk of being misunderstood or even targeted. But it was a risk that was worth it. Not immediately, but I'm getting there in a minute. There was something happened later. On Mexican Independence Day of 2006, Jesusa Rodriguez staged the proclamation of AMLO as legitimate president of Mexico in a massive event at the Zócalo. Soon afterwards, AMLO and their followers dismantled the plantón and went home to keep working on the next elections. As I mentioned, the effect of this massive disruption wasn't immediate. AMLO ran for president again in 2012 and lost to the conservative candidate Enrique Peña Nieto. Now, talking about political depression and anxiety that many of us might be experiencing while we expect the results of today's elections. Let me tell you a story. I worked in Chiapas, Mexico, in the city of San Cristobal de las Casas, in summer classes of art and resistance, organized by NYU and the Hemispheric Institute in 2010, 2011, and 2012. Jesusa Rodriguez was the invited artist, activist, or artivist to work with the students to think through creative resistance and to stage public interventions in the main square in San Cristobal de las Casas. The summer of 2012, the second time AMLO lost the elections, that was the first time that I saw Jesusa Rodriguez devastated, depressed, and hopeless. But that year was also when she told us that she was going to participate directly in politics, not as an artist or an activist, but as a citizen involved in political planning and campaigning. She didn't stop working in the arts. In 2014, she went to Chiapas again. Show you this. She went to Chiapas with the Art and Resistance class, and the group expanded their commitment, traveling around the border between Mexico and Guatemala, and visiting and working with the shelters offered to Central American migrants who tried to cross the Mexican border, hoping to somehow get to the US border, seeking for better lives. Jesusa Rodriguez staged a public intervention and that reminded of the thousands of bodies buried across Mexico, the massive cemetery of migrants who died before even getting close to the US border. This performance, as you can see the picture, makes death visible in a different way that narco terror might do it. It interpolates the audience at the same time that it invites the audience to acknowledge the reality of thousands of human beings dying. So she kept working on this kind of intervenciones. But while Jesusa Rodriguez kept working on this kind of performances, she officially joined AMLO's renewed party, Morena. And 4 months ago, this year, AMLO ran for president for the third time. And he won, actually in a landslide victory. This December, AMLO will start his government, and Jesusa Rodriguez will be a senator of the Republic. And this is happening now, after 6 years of her decision to join politics. So it takes time. It takes time. About the conceptual and practical meaning of artivism, Ricardo Dominguez and Stephen Ducombe remind us that art and activism operate in different levels, since activism seeks to, quote, defy and transform power relations, while art usually doesn't have a defined agenda, and therefore finds value in the space that escapes from concrete meaning and instead moves and generates affective responses. In this sense, Jesusa Rodriguez's decision opens a series of questions about how actual change can be achieved. This is an example of a person saying, I'm going to stop for a moment and I'm going to do politics in a concrete way. And this is a question that Regina Galindo, a Guatemalan artist who has been working in different places of the world, started to pose in 2003. This year, 2003, Regina Galindo was working in an office as a secretary. She took her lunchtime to perform this piece, ¿Quién puede borrar las huellas? Who can erase the traces or footprints? She walked with a basin filled with blood and walked from the Court of Constitutionality to the National Palace of Guatemala, leaving a trail of footprints in memory of the victims of the armed conflict in her country. After this, she went back to her desk and kept working. But soon after, she started an internationally renowned work as performance artist. This performance, ¿Quién puede borrar las huellas?, simple, minimal, and powerful at the same time, it's an act of remembrance and a defying gesture. Regina Galindo puts her body on the streets to summon the different bodies that are killed, disappeared, and forgotten in many Latin American countries where colonial mindset still persists. A minimal performance that dialogues with what Aníbal Quijano calls the coloniality of power, meaning the colonial domination that, in spite of the end of its political dimension, still exists in contemporary social structures. A coloniality of power that impacts the bodies of marginalized citizens. A public gesture in dialogue with Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics, and with Achille Mbembe's reflection of necropolitics, in the sense that in colonized realms and bodies, the colonizing power, quote, decides who matters and who doesn't matter, who is disposable and who is not, end of quote. All of the theoretical reflections about the body arise from Regina Galindo's body. And her performance defies the discipline of the body, the marginalization. She puts her body in order to think about what is happening with those thousands of bodies that are being basically destroyed. 2 weeks ago, in New York City, Regina Galindo performed the public intervention Carguen con sus muertos, Carry Your Dead, precisely to speak of the invisibilization of state crimes, narcoterror, and violence in Guatemala. In a 2-hour walk in the Lower East Side of the city, her body was inside one of those bags where corpses are disposed. A quotidian image in Guatemala. This surprised passers-by who knew the meaning of that bag. Many people didn't notice it, but those who noticed it had to think about it. After the performance, in New York City with this idea of the Empire State and the body bag being carried around in dialogue with what is happening, what is the role of the United States here, she asked the question, what can we do? And she was specifically thinking about the Central American migrant caravan, or Exodus. This caravan is actually asking us to think about the limits of the individual body and the possibilities of working through those bodies to make visible the marginalization, but also to think together about how to survive together. Actually, one of the points of the migrant caravan is to survive. It's a strategy of survival. If they walk together, it is more difficult that they get attacked by all the different people that has been killing and disappearing migrants throughout Mexico. So it's one body, Regina Galindo, and massive body of bodies. This dialogue is what performance is reflecting upon. So how far can activism can go when facing this kind of humanitarian crisis? What can we do? This is a constantly open question that haunts us every day. But one thing is certain, we must decolonize our own disciplines, our own ways of thinking and doing. We must decolonize theater, performance, or even activism. We have to think differently. There can be no discourse of decolonization, no theory of decolonization without that decolonizing practice, says Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. Accordingly, art, activism, and academia can weave collective alliances of resistance against policies that intend to control our bodies, to make us forget, and to make us think that the possibility of change is not on us. I always tell my students that everybody can perform. Like everybody can perform. To perform, you only need a body. That's it. So I want to finish with the last example of a collective artistic resistance and with a note of hope. Grupo Cultural Yuyashkani has been working in Peru since 1971, as I mentioned. In 2002, Yuyashkani staged El Bus de la Fuga, the escape bus, performed during the Semana Anticorrupción, Anti-Corruption Week in Lima, Peru. After the fall of the presidency of Alberto Fujimori in 2001, this was intense. So the extent of governmental corruption and its key players were being exposed by means of documentation which demonstrated that members of Fujimori's cabinet, Fujimorismo, had accepted bribes in addition to embezzling a great amount of money during his presidency. In this straight action, El Bus de la Fuga, members of Yuyashkani perform a critique of the abuses of power and the financial corruption that took place within Fujimori's government. The actors danced wearing masks to represent some of these political figures, including Fujimori and his advisor Montesinos. The group toured around Lima in a small bus, El Bus de la Fuga, and people reacted in different ways, to these political figures coming out and engaging with them. The openly corrupt government of Fujimori created in Peru what Miguel Rubio, director of Yuyashkani, calls a crisis of representation. And this is happening right now here. The crisis of representations in the sense of a constant doubt of the political representation that democratic governments supposedly guarantee. Are these people representing us? Seriously. So Fujimori escaped from justice for several years. He fled to exile to Japan in 2001 until 2005, when he was arrested in Chile and deported to be judged for crimes against human rights. He was finally convicted to 25 years of prison to these crimes and for political corruption. This was a victory in terms of international human rights in general, but on December 24, 2017, last year, Christmas Eve last year, the then Peruvian president Pedro Pablo Kuczynski granted Fujimori a humanitarian pardon indulto that was negotiated under the table. This caused massive protests in different cities of Peru, like this one in between Christmas and New Year's Eve of last year. So basically, Christmas was ruined, New Year's Eve was ruined, people were in the streets protesting. People took the streets to protest, again, el indulto, with the hashtag indulto es insulto, the pardon is an insult. And actually, the president who gave the indulto, he had to renounce in March this year. Now, Keiko Fujimori, Alberto Fujimori's daughter, she had been working with her father since he was in government. And it's now clear that she was involved in multiple corruption cases through her father's political organization. And this is a picture when Fujimori was released. So they had a nice Christmas, and a lot of people didn't. Keiko Fujimori ran for president in 2011 and 2016, losing in both years. Multiple protests in the streets have opposed her candidacy and have asked for justice for the corruption crimes of Fujimorismo. So I want to highlight that these massive protests were filled with creativity, with music, with dance. It's not your usual protest. We're thinking of da, 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 da. It wasn't that. It was really, really creative, theatrical. Yoshkane has been a crucial part of this. And this is very interesting. They were really, really active since the first signs of Keiko Fujimori trying to be president were out there. This is what happened. Remember the mask of El Bus de la Fuga in 2002? They dusted off those same masks to go to the streets again. When I talked to them, they pointed out that the only change is like they painted gray hairs and some wrinkles. It was the same exact mask. They went again, they put their bodies in motion again to protest injustice. Remember that Jesus Rodriguez waited for so long, and now there is a light of hope. There is also the relentless struggle to keep protesting and doing it again and again and again. So they were out there in the streets with the masks. And I don't want to say to put a cause-effect relationship here, but on Halloween, Keiko Fujimori was sent to jail. She's in preventive prison until she is trial for corruption crimes. Again, I'm not saying that it's a cause and effect, but I want to think that it's a relationship between these massive protests and the way that they work, okay, and the way that they make people think about our current politics. On a final note, what is left to do? What can we do? Many things. As I mentioned, everybody can perform a public intervention. Everybody can join a creative resistance. Let's identify microfascisms and counteract them in unexpected and creative ways. And I had a conversation today. A way to do it is, for example, painting graffiti on a bus. That is an actual counteraction to microfascisms. Let's not forget the power of collaboration. Transnational collaborations are very important because this is not only about Latin America, but about the Americas. It is about all of us. I started mentioning Augusto Boal's random gentilicios, random adjectives of nationality, in his games for actors and non-actors. Boal has Colombian hypnosis, the Peruvian ball game, Bolivian mimosas, Chinese crisis, totally random. I think this is a way to defy national identifications that might block possibilities for collaboration and the flux of ideas and action. Let's think about the hemisphere together and propel collective movements in the configuration of new transnational networks of political resistance. We don't know what will come after today, But as the late Jose Muñoz would say, from a shared critical dissatisfaction, we arrive at collective potentiality. Thank you.
So we have time for questions and answers. I have the magic microphone so that we can all hear questions that you have to ask. Just raise your hand if you have something you'd like to ask Leticia. I can get the ball rolling. You talked about this disciplining of bodies and the disciplining of theater, right, and of art. In the context of street protest, I imagine, we know that states often seek ways of criminalizing protest, disciplining, controlling, and limiting the effects of sort of the massification of protest, right? Are there some specific ways that you can share with us that states in Latin America have sought to criminalize this kind of artivism, as you're calling it?
Yes, that is a really great question because thinking about what is happening in the United States, for example, you have ways of getting a permit to protest and therefore cover yourself, okay, or be sure that nothing could happen. In Latin America, you don't get a permit to protest, so you're always at risk. What is happening, for example, is there are several ways that the police is sent to break a protest. It's not always targeted to, for example, this creative game of Yuyashkani, but what is happening a lot now is, for example, these protests related to pro-choice movements, where women put their bodies there and protest naked, for example. So the discipline of the body is targeting specific bodies and ways to show the body. So this is not about the protest, because you are not doing something that is illegal, because you are out there in the streets, but you are showing your body. And that's why some, performers, activists, they choose to do that and to go to jail for a couple of days. Now, I'm interested in the counteraction to that as well, because the ways that police is going to repress you, that is always expected. That's always probably going to happen. But the response is what interests me, and the ways out, right? For example, working with something that is called just a performance and not a protest. Or using tactics. Here in the States, there is the Illuminator. This is a group artist. The Illuminator projects phrases in specific buildings. So the projector is somewhere, not in that building, but in the opposite building, right? So you're occupying that building symbolically, and you are not doing something that is illegal, per se. So again, the disciplining of the bodies is going to happen. How do you manage to walk around is what makes the protest, I think, effective and potentially transformative.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I have a question. A colleague of mine in communication does a project looking at how right-wing movements actually take left-wing tactics and then try and exploit them on their behalf. Can you talk about any examples of that from your research?
Yes, thank you. I mentioned that fascism is not creative, and that is a perfect example of that, right? Stealing ideas. There are several examples back in Peru, for example. Groups of people chanting or trying to get funny moments to their protest. In Argentina, in the pro-choice marches that were massive, there was this group of anti-pro-choice, and it had this weird fetus in a form, as it was a giant baby, like a balloon, like a Macy's balloon. It was strange, and it was a way to be being creative with the baby, but it was badly performed, if you want. So everything can be co-opted, for sure, co-opted and transformed into nothing, not destroyed. But what is interesting is that for every time that far right or fascism tries to co-opt a creative form of resistance, another new starts, right? And I'm really interested in the memes and meme culture, because if you think about that, the funniest memes come from, if you want more liberal thinking. And then you have replicas that are more conservative, but they have then another meme that comes from the other side, right? Sometimes, far right fascism kind of hit a note, if you want, but it's not that usual. So I would say for everything that is stolen, multiple things are going to arise. Mm-hmm.
The students are
Yeah,
letting the
okay.
faculty dominate. Never let people dominate.
That's the point of this, right? So I'm wondering, in your view, if there is a real difference between protest, like if there's a real line between protest and performance, or if all protest is performance.
Yes, I would say all protests are performance, but that is from my theoretical framework. So I think in these terms, performance is whatever you bracket. So this is actually a performance, okay, but also the act of the audience can be also a performance. If you go to the dining hall and you bracket it and study it as performance, okay, you're going to find a series of repetitions and actions that could be read as performance. So there is a distinction between is performance and as performance. So if you define this is performance, this is performance, this is performance, you're going to go insane, really. But if you say this can be viewed as performance, then you can dissect it. You can analyze it. And also you can find ways of bringing this, for example, to a different context. So it's as the lens, as a way from where you approach to the event that makes it relevant and meaningful in terms of performance. So from this, when I see protests, I see them as performance. And I analyze them, I think, okay, so what we can learn from them and how we can make them more effective. What is not working? What is working? And one of the ideas is that they work, but the way that they are effective cannot be measured in immediate response, right? I was talking about moments of crisis when things can go worse, for worse or for bad, and thinking about Brazil and Bolsonaro. I think their moment of crisis, the critical moment, was the moment of the impeachment of Dilma. That was the moment when things could go any way. I think now things went worse and we don't know what to expect, right? But thinking about also the strategies used by them, okay, there were a lot of, exploitation of fear, for example, in the Brazilian society to get to that point. So I see performance everywhere, basically. First. You first.
You better do it, because it might take a question.
Thank you, Dr. Robles, for being here today. I have a couple questions. So my first is, what form of art do you think is most efficient in creating like a political message, creating just messages? So there's theater, there's music, there's literature, there's visual arts. So I'm actually doing a project on how art influences social movements and revolutions in Latin America, and I'm having trouble kind of narrowing down, because everything is interesting and everything I want to know, but I guess I just want to tackle this by, what do you think is the most efficient way of doing art to make movements? And also my second question would be, how can Latino students living in the U.S. stay informed about things that happen in our Latin American countries? Like, all of these movements are like, how come I didn't know about this? You know, like, I care about them so much and I connect to them on a different level because of my background, but how come I don't know about, like our news is filtered through like domestic issues, but how can we stay informed? Like, how do you stay informed? What news do you watch, or like podcasts or something?
Okay, I'm going to start with the second question. I think we are very overwhelmed because of the weight of the events that are happening everywhere, right? So we tend to shut down. We tend to say, I'm not going to read this. I'm going to watch the kitties video, right? And I do that a lot. It's like, okay, I need my kitty video today. But actually, all that information is out there. Not only, I mean, of course in your classes, of course with your professors, of course reading, but for example, these names. So if you look for Regina Galindo, you're going to see the multiple pieces that she has performed throughout the year, some of them brutal, okay, to put her body at the service of a message about what is happening in Guatemala. Now, if you look for Jesusa Rodriguez, you're going to find her cabaret work and what she is doing now. And it's very interesting because I believe in networks, cultural networks. I don't think that, none of these artists is isolated. If you look for Jesusa Rodriguez, you're going to find Liliana Felipe, her wife. She's a singer, wonderful singer. So you follow Liliana Felipe, and she's from Argentina. You're going to find Canción Protesta in the 60s, okay, in 70s, throughout the dictatorship, right? So you have to follow the thread, and it's hard work because again, you start following the thread, you get to Argentina, and you get to the horrors of the dictatorship. But I think it's important to do that. It's how I didn't know about this. It's because it's a lot, right? But it's the conscious decision of following those threads and learning about that. And mostly as a Latino student, because that is part also of your history, that is part of you. And it's a double thing because you also have to follow what is happening in the United States. And again, it's a lot. And again, once in a while, you're going to need to stop, to breathe, to watch videos, and then go back. Now, after the events, the Pittsburgh shooting, Kentucky, Brazil was a brutal week. We talked about that with my students, and yes, the idea of shutting down and thinking it was too much. We talked about that. We paused for 1 second, and then you start over. So that is a conscious decision. And about your first question, what is more efficient? That is a very difficult question. It is very difficult because how do you measure efficiency, right? Is it efficient if you get Keiko Fujimori into jail? Is it efficient if after 6 years you get your candidate to win the elections? Is it efficient if you convince one person to change their mind and try to do things in a different ways? right? So I would pause for 1 second and think about this idea of efficiency, and think about the different levels and the different reach of that said efficiency, and think about how, for example, music can transform one person, right? And a big group of people working together maybe can transform an entire community, right? So I would say, keep thinking about that. Keep, pulling, thinking, okay, where I'm getting. But I would say rethink the way that you think about what is a transformation and what levels of transformation we have. Because we have big revolutions, but also we have small acts of resistance. I talk about microfascism and the same microaggressions, right? If you think about that, you can also think about minimal acts of counteraction, acts of resistance. It helps.
Other questions? We have time for a couple more.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. This has been such a fascinating presentation. I was just curious. I think so often, at least I see women at the forefront of so much of this artivism, which I think is amazing. But I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on why that is. Like, what do you think drives women to do this work so often across cultures too? Yeah.
Did you notice what I did? What I did? Like all women performers. Yes, it's not only because I love this woman, right? My thoughts about that, well, it's resilience. A lot of that is based on the fact of because of patriarchy, because how our societies are set so far. Being a woman, okay, or being female identified, or being inhabiting the female side of humanity is a constant struggle. It's a constant act of survival. But also a part of resilience, I think a sense of community as well. Now, historically, if we think about that, the possibilities of keeping the community sense usually are related to female identities, right? So I'm really, really thinking through the idea of the collective. And that, if we think about that, that is a lot related to these female identifications, right? There are multiple different answers to that, also depending on the context, right? Of course, for example, Jesusa Rodriguez is a queer woman, right? So queerness is part of her exploration as well of responding and being at the forefront of change, right? Patricia Ariza, she is a survivor of a massive murdering of leftist activists in the 70s and 80s in Bogota, in the entirety of Colombia. So there were basically death squads killing activists, and she survived somehow. So her presence as a person who believes in change and in a culture of peace also draws from there. And if you think about, for example, Regina Galindo, I'm always at awe of her work and the fact that one day she decided to do something, right? And her thinking is her doing. So depending on the context, you're going to find different ways, but I would explore the sense of collectivity. And now it's called sisterhood, right? That female identities usually tend to cultivate, to look for. Thank you for your question. There's one person there.
So sorry, is that too loud? Okay. Have you noticed social media changing how artivism affects people in the last decade or two? And also does that change how bodies are disciplined when they aren't actually on the line, when people can be doing this through a screen and not physically there?
Yes, I've also written about this and think about this. Thank you for your question. We have the Facebook activist, the infamous idea of the Facebook activist. I do believe in social media as a tool for social change. I do believe in the power of hashtag, and also I believe in the power of organization in transnational level that social media can have. So you know what is happening everywhere because of social media. And I also believe in strategies that you can use through social media. For example, during the South Dakota pipeline, there was this action that was checking in Standing Rock, right? To basically confuse the data about how many people were there. Because there was a specific action through social media. Now, what I think is that it has to be back and forth. From social media, from the digital avenues to the physical avenues. And back to regroup, to coordinate, to organize, and go back again, right? And that doesn't mean only going to protests in the streets. It can also mean to go and vote, right? Because I've seen a lot of people campaigning in social media, and today there's an actual moment of going there and doing something, right? But one without the other, at this point in history, I don't think they can survive. So social media, the internet is here for good. It's not going anywhere. So protests are in dialogue with that already. And I've seen a lot of tactic conversations, through social media that then emerge in the streets. So one with the other all the time. That's what I think. It's useful, but it's not enough if you only stay in the internet.
So I'd like to, in closing, I'd like to encourage people to look for our announcement of our series for next semester, which will continue the Politics of the Imagination theme, but with a focus on historical memory. Right? So the work of creative, imaginative work in remembering historically, in other words, beyond our personal individual memories within our biographical lives, ability to remember erased history, question official narratives of history, and so forth. We'll be focusing on that next semester. And we're going to kick off with a theater residency, which will be week-long, led by two practitioners of theater of the oppressed who work with our students in Guatemala. I don't know if you want to say some words about
I do. That. Remember that I said that everybody can perform? Actually, this residency is a perfect example and a great opportunity for that. The RAD group, the group has been doing a lot of actions related, it's reflection, action, dialogue, right? So if you're thinking about, for example, I feel like I'm in social media and I'm not doing anything else, join this group, this residency, okay? You don't need to be a virtuoso of, the theater or a dancer or musician. If you are, fantastic, right? But if you don't need you don't need this to do it. You can just join and find the potentialities of your own body, right? Basically, we're constrained. We are disciplined. And getting out of that is what opens our imagination to do interventions, performances, forum theater, theater of the oppressed. So if you can join, do it. And I think, yes, Roy has a sign-up sheet. He's going to pitch it.
Yes, so I'm Roy Ketchum, and I'm sort of the faculty mentor for Reflection Action Dialogue here on campus. And I kind of actually have an answer to this question a little bit, is to say that in some ways, in Leticia, we have both scholar, which we saw today, the way that she informed us about lots of these movements going on in Latin America, but she's also a practitioner, and the practitioner side is the part that makes me think about all politics is local. So here on campus, you can get involved in Reflection Action Dialogue as by participating, all of you, by participating in the Theater to the Press training workshop that we're going to have in January. And the best way to get started with that is to get your name on my list right here, and then I'll follow up with you with more information.
Thank you, Roy. One final remark. I was remiss at the beginning in failing to mention that Leticia's presence here in tonight's event was co-sponsored by the Global Awareness Lecture Series. Very thankful for the generous support there. I want to thank all of you all for coming. Those of you who are enrolled in LLAS 270, come check in with me briefly before you leave. And thank you again for coming. Thank you, Leticia.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.